So what now? What comes next? Today, as we are walking through this path of the coronavirus pandemic, there's all sorts of argument about what comes next. When do we open businesses? Which businesses should be open? What do we do about the healthcare? How do we monitor the state and spread of the virus? How do we learn to treat it? How do we vaccinate against it? What comes next? What comes next for churches? When do we open up and start having our full gatherings? And when will people feel safe again to come out for such a gathering? Our world has been flipped around, turned upside down, and it's hard to know what comes next. It was even harder, I think, for the disciples. Now we have a certain sense of normalcy that we want to return to, a certain sense of business as usual that we want to get back to, even though we know we won't fully go back to it. But for the disciples, everything had been overturned. Everything was different. Their lives now would not be the same. Luke actually doesn't tell us much about the resurrection. This is the only major story that he tells us, and he tells it in great detail, rather than giving us lots of appearances. And I think the reason is because he wants us to see in this story of the walk to Emmaus, he wants us to see a pattern of how this resurrection should change us, how this resurrection should reshape our lives, how we should indeed be different. The story begins in dejection and defeat. All seemed hopeless. The disciples were walking along the road, talking about what had been going on. We thought Jesus was going to be the one who would deliver Israel. We thought he would come and make everything right again. We thought that the Romans would finally be overthrown and kicked out. We thought we would finally see the glory of our ancestor David on his throne again. We thought our moment had finally come. But now, what's there to even hope for? We thought Jesus was dead. The disciples are each heading back to their own lives, at least the ones other than the 11, and their old ways of dealing with things. We thought he would deliver us. Truth is, how many times have we thought the same thing? We come to some new insight in our faith, and we think that now God will make everything right for us. A new job, a marriage, children, winning the lottery. All sorts of things that we think might be our salvation, that might finally put everything right for us. And before long, it seems that it goes up in a puff of smoke. It comes to an end. The truth is, when we depend on what we see here, what we see in this life, it will always be an illusion. This life will come to an end. The things that bring us hope, that give us confidence in the course of this life, will come to an end. They are always fleeting, always passing. Just as it was for those first disciples. The hope that they had, the dreams that they had, the way they expected everything to finally be made right, went away in that puff of smoke known as the crucifixion. And then something happens and we begin to search again. And we find Jesus again revealed to us in some way. And we want to listen more. Those disciples on the road, they didn't recognize it or admit it at the time, but they knew their hearts burned within them. They knew there was something else. They knew that there was something more. They knew that God had come to them. But yet they couldn't embrace it. They couldn't own it. They couldn't let it shake the despair, the hopelessness, the lostness. But Jesus was at work. One of the great wonders of the faith is how often Jesus is at work in us before we even see it, before we are aware of it. In fact, we even have a term for it. In theological terms, we call it prevenient grace. The work of God in our lives before we ask for it, before we recognize it. Can you look back over your life and see how God has been at work? Bringing you in touch with certain people, bringing you closer to Him, bringing you here. Even though you weren't seeking Him, you were given ways to find Him. You didn't see Him yet, but there He was, making Himself known. And then that moment comes, and we see that yes, indeed, He is at work. Yes, indeed, He is there. We catch a glimpse of Jesus as we encounter Him, and we are fed by Him. Luke seems to want us to see that in the Eucharist. In fact, the language that he used at the very end is very clear when he said, He was known to us in the breaking of the bread. It's the same language he used at the beginning of the book of Acts, his volume 2 of Luke's great opus. The breaking of the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers as the way that God is at work in us. And He wants us to see that we are then fed by Him, and just like the disciples, we are transformed by His presence. But yet that moment of encounter is not the thing to hold on to. That's not where it centers. The disciples were told as soon as they recognized Jesus, He disappeared from their sight. I'll admit I find that puzzling. When I read it, I often wonder, why? Why disappear now? You have your chance. They're listening now. You have your captive audience. But I do think there is a lesson here. Because the object of Jesus coming to us, the object of us encountering God in our lives, is never for us to just revel in that moment. It is always for us to be sent out. It is always for us to move in growth, in faith, in service, to be sent to tell others. I've seen far too many Christians spending so much of their lives trying to recapture some past moment, some past experience of God. But encountering God and His work in our lives is not about staying in that moment. It's about moving on to the next thing that He calls us to. You see, as human beings, we tend to think that those ecstatic experiences are to be repeated. In God's economy, they're never for their own sake. They are always for the sake of our transformation and of our call to service. And so to sustain that experience for the disciples would have caused them to just want more and more and more of it, rather than to realize that they were now to look to each other and to take what had happened and how God had been revealed to them and carry it forward, to carry it out. Now, it did take them a little while. They didn't rush right out. They were clothed with power from on high, we are told. But follow the pattern. After the confusion, the dejection, the loss, the realization that our final salvation will never come in the course of this life. That this life is not going to be the be-all and end-all for us. But rather, we are here to encounter something greater. That we are here to encounter God with us, God among us. To see Jesus, even just in a moment, even just in a glimpse. And then to be transformed by that vision, to be transformed by that moment, so that we are thrust out in invitation, in drawing others into that same moment, just as others have been for us. That moment when we encounter God, that bit of prevenient grace. Now we have the privilege of going out in service, and in doing so being that moment of prevenient grace in the lives of others, and to invite the others into that same joy, and ultimately into that same life of service. That's the so what. That's what we do because he lives. Amen.